Welcome to this brief presentation on some of the common problems seen in medical device risk management documentation. My name is Dale Hallerberg, and I'm with Active Alliance, and I'll be your guide through today's presentation. In working with manufacturers on their risk management documentation, I've noticed several common problems that occur again and again, and today we'll talk about three of these common problems. First, the failure to define a risk management policy for what is acceptable risk. Second, using the instructions for use as the first method to reduce risks. And third, forgetting to look at risks that come from risk control measures. Let's dig into these. The table shown on this slide comes from one of the informative annexes in the standard ISO 14971. And tables such as this are very common in risk management documentation. This shows the criteria for what is an acceptable risk. But how were these criteria decided upon? Many manufacturers have had trouble with defining their policy for determining this acceptable risk. Here's the requirement from Clause 3.2 of ISO 14971. And you'll notice in the boxed area that top management shall define and document their policy for determining the criteria for risk acceptability. So it's not enough to just determine criteria, but you have to document your policy for coming up with this criteria. The answer to this problem is handled in two steps. First of all, add a section to your risk management policy which is similar to what is shown on the screen. Now there's no need for you to hand copy this. If you'll email me, I'll be glad to send you this text. Later on in the presentation, I'll show you my email. The second stage in the answer is to use that policy when defining the risk acceptability criteria. So on the left on this slide, you'll see an overall risk management policy, which includes the policy for determining risk acceptability criteria. And then from this policy comes the actual criteria for risk acceptability, which is documented in the risk management file for the particular device. Our second common problem to discuss is the tendency to use instructions for use as the first method to reduce risk. Sometimes this is a policy, but more often it's just the actual practice to jump immediately to using the instructions for use to try to reduce risks. The actual requirement is stated in Clause 6.2 of ISO 14971, and it says quite clearly that the manufacturer shall use a risk control option in the priority order shown. First is inherent safety, second, protective measures in the device, and finally, information for safety, which would include markings on the device and instructions for use. The answer to this problem also has two steps. First is making sure the policy is in place, and then secondly that the policy is followed. So here I recommend that you add to your risk management policy something similar to what's shown. In this I've gone beyond what the standard requires and added 5 elements in the priority order listed. First, inherent safety by design, then protective measures, then markings, and then instructions. And I've done this because I believe that markings are going to be more effective in getting information to the user than instructions for use. And finally, I've added training at the end. Training can be an excellent risk reduction approach. However, it's rather unpredictable. If it's done, it's great, and if it's not done, it's of no value at all. Similar to the earlier problem, the policy for the overall risk management will now hold the policy for risk control option analysis. And from this policy comes the priority for choice of risk controls. And this must be driven into the process that the engineers and experts follow when they document the actual risk controls that are chosen to reduce risk for the individual hazards. This is then documented in the risk management file for the particular device. Our third common problem for discussion is that of forgetting to look at risks that come from other risk control measures. Now we know that implementation of a risk control measure may sometimes lead to either changes in existing risks or new risks altogether. This isn't very common though, and also since it's late in the process, these tend to get overlooked. The requirements from ISO 14971 for this issue are in Clause 6.6, where we see two parts. Part A, the effects of the risk control measures have to be reviewed for the introduction of new hazards. And Part B have to be reviewed for previously identified hazardous situations to see if they're affected. At the bottom of Clause 6.6, we see the important information that says these new or increased risks have to be managed in accordance with 4.4 to 6.5 of the standard. In other words, these new or increased risks are fed back into the risk management system as a whole and have to be addressed. By now you can guess that the answer is in two steps. First, let's make sure that your risk management policy has something similar to what's shown here to handle risks arising from risk control measures. The policy will become part of your overall risk management policy, and now it includes this policy for risks which arise from other risk control measures. From that comes the requirement to reevaluate after these risk control measures are implemented. And then in the risk management file for the device, we document the evaluation of new risks or increased risks which come from the implementation of the risk control measures. In summary, we discussed three common problems in documenting risk management for medical devices. We discussed the policy for defining acceptable risk, using instructions for use, and risks that arise from risk control measures. As we wrap up, I'd like to let you know that the policy text shown in this presentation is available by emailing me, dh@activealliance.solutions. I hope this was helpful and thank you for your attention. Good day.